Well, thank you, Bill, ever so much for joining us today. It's fantastic to see and hear you. How are you keeping?
I'm keeping very well. The Lord has blessed me with good health, me and my wife, and we've been hunkering down like most people in this world, but safely within a bubble and still active in our core.
Brilliant. That's great to hear. So, in today's episode, we're going to be doing an analysis of one of your pieces, To the Chief Musician. I guess the first question I'd like to ask you is what was the inspiration behind writing this?
My dear friend and mentor, Commissioner Richard E. Holtz, was our territorial commander for a very short while. I think it was like maybe 2 years at the most. And it was his last appointment before retirement. So the chief secretary calls me like he's in the CIA. He's calling me like that. He says, Himes, the boss is retiring. I want you to write a piece, but it's got to be a secret, And so he says, I'll find out what his 3 favorite songs are. So I'm at music camp in the summertime up in Minnesota, and I get this call. It goes, okay, Himes, here are the 3 tunes. Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah, Qumranda, I Bring Thee All, in Boston. Click. That's it. So now I got these 3 tunes, and it's all going to be a deep, dark secret. So those are the things I know. Those are the influences. Then 2 other things were happening in my life at that time. The New English Bible had come out a couple of years before, and it was really lauded for its exceptional translation, especially of the poetry of the Bible, the Psalms and things like that. So I'd gotten that Bible, and I did what I don't recommend people do. I started at Genesis and just read straight through to Revelation. The Bible's not sequential in that way, of course. So you're taking each book as it comes. But I still that was how I was getting through it. And about that time, I was really into the Psalms when this assignment came. So there's an influence, And then I think of Holtz, and I think, what is he? He's the chief musician. He's the guy that has done so much to promote musical development, not only in the USA Eastern Territory, but the world, And so I thought of him as the chief musician. So the Psalms became a basis. Then another thing happened was long after the death of John Kennedy, they had many memorials, and one of them was like a center for the performing arts in Washington, D.C., and they were doing a big dedication, and they asked none other than Leonard Bernstein to write a work for this occasion, and he wrote a piece called Mass. And Mass was such a highly interactive piece. It had an orchestra, it had a choir, it had a children's choir, it even had a brass band that marched down at one point, not necessarily in the British style, but just a sort of a rowdy bunch that came across the stage at some point. And I was struck by, when I heard that performance, just how interactive it was with so many different textures. And so then my mind started applying that thought, how could I write a piece that could be more interactive, more than just brass and percussion sounds, but other sounds as well, the spoken voice, the singing voice, and yet have it economical enough that it didn't have to be a Royal Albert Hall thing where you had Voices of 1,000 and the International Staff Band. It could be just a band itself, and self-contained within that, with some strategic thinking, you could actually have the band do more than just play. And so those were influences that I chose. Those were choices that I chose to take. Now, I had these 3 tunes. But when you think of the Psalms, they're just so, they were sung when they were first heard, of course, but to take various texts. So I somehow I happened on enter into his gates with thanksgiving and into his courts with praise. That became the introit. Now, here's a funny thing. And so the chief secretary said to me, the first tune, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah, Qumranda. So I start working away on the first movement, and I'm basing even the opening on the tune. And I worked on it for a day or two, and it was like maybe 3, 4 o'clock in the morning where I finished this first movement. And as I do, I thought, okay, I'm just going to go to the tune book now to make sure that I've gotten every interval correct, because sometimes we sing songs a certain way, but it's not really how the person wrote them. I looked and I had the wrong tune. I didn't have Cum Ronda. Da, 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 da. I had Bread of Heaven. Da, 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 da. And that was my opening. The whole piece is based on this motif. And I remember saying out loud to myself as I looked at the score and looked at the tune book, I said, well, Holtz, you got a new favorite tune, because there's no way I'm changing this. So that part was really quite by accident. But I just landed on the wrong tune, but the motif became, the anchor for the whole piece.
Let's dip into the score now for To the Chief Musician. And listeners at home, as usual, can find the score and follow along with it on the Salvation Army Music Index if they'd like to. So the first movement here, the introit that you talked about, we start off with this antiphonal fanfare of the cornets and the trombones, the real symphonic instruments of the band. Could you talk us through this introduction?
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, the opening framework is Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah, Bread of Heaven. Ba-da-da-da. And then it's kind of an abstraction, but that kind of thing. It's all motivic from that. And then it shifts into a compound meter, because I'm looking now at the rhythm of the text, because I want this Psalm 100 to come through in a naturally rhythmic way. I don't want it to sound, contrived or forced. So when you hear,
enter, enter, enter into his gates, enter into his gates, enter into his gates with thanksgiving, enter into his gates with thanksgiving, enter thanksgiving, enter thanksgiving, and into his courts.
It's just kind of a natural cadence, and into his courts, and into his courts, and it just goes back and forth. That compound meter seemed to suit that, and so that's basically what happens. So you have just an opening to get their attention, and then it goes right into scripture, and then it comes back to that framework motif of Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah. And then I will say there's a little a fanfare that comes through, and this is from what I call my blurb book. A blurb is just a fragment of an idea, and this is an idea I got when I was in music school. If you had a thought on something, you just wrote it down. It might be 3 or 4 bars, and it was a blurb. And I had this whole folder full of blurbs from over the years, and one of them was the And so I was looking through these blurbs to just see, is there anything there I could use? And I happened on that and I go, now is the time for this. I bet that blurb was 10 years old. So then after that, you've set up those 3 things. You've got the tune, you got the scripture, you got the motif. It pretty well does itself, and it's very dance-like when it says enter into his courts with praise. And that's kind of what I envision here. Just we're coming in to worship the Lord on a Sunday. And isn't it great to see everybody? And here we are, that kind of thing. And then after all of that fanfare and procession, then we get to the tune, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah. I don't like disguising a tune so that people are left to wonder what was that. I think our what does it say? Make the message clear and plain. Christ receiveth sinful men. You want the message to be clear and plain. So it does that, and you don't want this to go on too long because it's going to be a suite. So it doesn't have to be eternal to be immortal, as they say. So it's fairly brief, and I hopefully leaves the audience wanting more. So on to the second movement. Obviously, in a suite, it's not an original idea to go fast, slow, fast. The contrasting movements. The second movement is the cleansing the palate. You know, if you think of it as a meal, you've had something, and now you're going to just have a little bit of sherbet to cleanse the palate before you go on. And the second movement is just a beautiful thought and a tune by Eva Booth. And what I remembered too was that when they were asking the Holtzes, kind of in a sneaky way, what their tunes were, you see, the chief secretary couldn't give away why he wanted to know this. So he had to be very surreptitious about the thing. And so what he did first was he said to Commissioner Holtz, hey, I got to give a lecture at the University of Chicago on hymn tunes and hymn songs and gospel songs. He says, but boss, tell me, what makes a good song? What makes a good hymn? And so Holtz, in his very laborious handwriting, very slowly, he's writing out a whole 3-4 pages of thoughts on what makes a song good. He says, oh, it should fit within an octave. It should be intuitive. He's doing it like a musicologist. And then the chief says, yeah, I see what you're saying there, boss, but like, give me some examples. Like, what are tunes you like? And that was his sneaky way of getting it out, you see. And so then Holtz said, well, you know, I like this and this. But then his wife tapped him on the arm, Ruby Holtz, and said, oh, Richard, don't forget I bring the all. And he says, oh, yes, yes. So that became the second song. And it's just so lovely. And so therefore, it has kind of a, after all that rowdiness of the opening processional, complete contrast. Now it's very, very sort of ethereal and mystical. And the sounds are very simple, long lines, but it allows, it becomes an underscore to the narration, which often is neglected in a performance. Often you'll hear the band just go right into I Bring the All. But it is special when you hear
the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise. I bring thee all my sins. None can forgive but thee. I bring thee all.
And then it elides into the text of Booth that says, I bring thee all my sins. None can forgive but thee. I bring thee all. Those two thoughts really connect. And so the spoken word, I think, is just as important as what happens when we play there. It just kind of sets it up using scripture in those lyrics. So then, without further ado, once that's established that mood, the tune comes in very simply. There's a little heartbeat that begins at the beginning of this piece, the bum, 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 and that's ever present through this piece. There's only maybe 3 or 4 bars where that pulsating figure is not there. It's just like we're living life, and it's going on. It's very subtle. It's in the background, but what's prominent is the song I Bring Thee All, and then it finishes as it began, just very quietly. Interesting thing, Matthew, I know you're a trombone player. You're interested in my theory on this, is that I think the trombones are the closest thing to the human voice in a brass band. And so what I was striving to do here was, as this sunsets at the end, as it just kind of fades away, finally we just have a 4-voice chord and the trombones are holding that. And then the band is instructed to just imitate that sound, to just hum it, not overtly where we hear people sing like, nothing like that, but just fitting into you're just humming along with the trombones, and the trombones eventually fade away. and the voices become the reverb. They're just, the sound continues. And it sort of leaves the audience wondering, how did they do that? You know, the trombones are playing, now they're not playing, but I still hear the trombones. How is that? And that's why I chose them, because I thought they came closest to, especially the male voice, which was prominent in bands, certainly at that time. But so it ends very, very mysteriously. And also, I would say a little bit of impishness on my part, but Commissioner Holtz was all about color. He was always talking about the Leidson idea of the bright sounds and the mellower sounds, those timbres, and they were either distinctly segregated or they were lovingly intermixed, and how you could come up with these spectrums of color. And I thought, Holtz, I'm going to give you a color you've never heard. And that was part of the motivation for the end of this movement. And again, it was interesting at the time of the performance, because I think he actually looked quite baffled. It's like, what just happened there? How did, you know? So it's just something between me and him, but I think musically it works well. I should also say that when I finished this movement, I could relate to Eric Ball a little bit. And I know that sounds presumptuous. How could anyone relate to the master? But he was a great mentor in my life. And I remember asking about something they'd written at one point, and I said, you know, where did that come from? And he said, I don't honestly know. You know, I after it was all done, I looked at it and I thought, I did this. And that's kind of a feeling I have after the second movement, which isn't intricate, it's not complex, it's not highly technical music. But after it was all done, and the next morning when I got up and I looked at the score, it was almost in third person. It was like, oh, I see what he did here. It was just, it was something like it was out of your hands. It was like, oh, I see. And it sort of made perfect sense. It's a weird kind of experience, but sometimes that happens.
Really interesting to hear that, and it is a beautiful, ethereal ending. Unfortunately, I'm not a trombonist. I haven't gone to the dark side. I'm still on the cornet.
Oh, sorry about that, Matthew.
That's all right.
I was trying to picture you in my mind where I saw you in the band.
That's right. I haven't gone to the dark side yet.
Yeah. Well, you look like a trombonist.
Oh dear. Oh no. So that brings us on to the third and final movement of the piece, entitled Worship, Allegro con Fuoco. Could you talk us through what happens here in this very exciting and climactic movement?
Well, again, this is something, it's exciting music, but it's not difficult. My core band has played this. In fact, we did a whole holiness meeting around this piece one time. It's really quite playable. It's not a test piece by any means. But I was actually sitting in a morning meeting as I'm thinking of this text, worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. And I'm also thinking of the tune Boston, which is actually the same contour of tune that the band is going to sing, only in a minor key. It's all derivative of the tune Boston. I don't have many ideas, so I have to use a few ideas well, and that's what I'm doing here. The other thing that struck me was, what is the meter of these words? How does it work? And so I'm actually in the service during the sermon, I'm just kind of tapping on my knee, this rhythm, worship the Lord, worship the Lord, worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. I'm trying to put it in into a pulse. It's not the way we would say it, but it's the way we would sing it. So then I thought, well, what does that look like? And then I realized this is what we would call a polyrhythm. It's a mixed meter, where your quaver is the unifying meter to it. So it's actually 3 quavers followed by 6 quavers, or 3 full beats, if you will. So it's 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, da, 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 da. So the time signature, and I'm surprised they allowed me to do this, but it's the only piece I know in the Salvation Army that's actually published this way, that has 3/8 plus 3/4. And it's right at the beginning of the piece. It doesn't put the time sign at every bar line or anything like that. It's like, no, this is how it is. So if you're, say the horns resting at letter A, you're going to count it 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3. And it's a very simple instruction. I've never had a band fall apart over that. You just explain it once and they go, yeah, okay. Well, nowadays they write it as 9/8 time, which actually I don't care for, because it's 1 bar, but it doesn't really show the pulse the way you'd want. You can get all the right number of beats in there, but probably boring you with theory now. But anyhow, I came up with 3/8 plus 3/4. And fortunately, the powers that were, I think Lieutenant Colonel Ray Bowes for that, they published it that way. And it's the only band piece I know that has it that way. But it's not to be clever or tricky. It's to fit the words and the text in a very natural way. After the tune is introduced, then the band sings it, and you'll note that the accompaniment is very sparse. Again, this is the logistical part that I was talking about. How can I make this playable by a band, but with no other extra bodies in the group? And so less is more. So I just have the euphoniums playing in fifths with percussion from time to time, providing some pulse as well. But they're just playing fifths while the singers are singing most of the time in 2 parts. And again, you don't need to have a lot of voicings to the chords to make it work. They're singing in 2 parts all the way through this, just about.
Worship the Lord, worship the Lord, worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. Worship the Lord, worship the Lord, worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. Give unto the Lord the glory due unto his name.
So then that text is fully realized from the Psalms. Given to the Lord the glory due unto his name, and then it returns to the worship the Lord part. And then there's a little recitative by just a solo tenor voice who just sings very ad libitum, worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. And he's just left holding that note, which now leads us very easily, quietly into Boston. When I survey the wondrous cross. Once we hit that, again, I've said this many times, I have few ideas, so I have to take the few that I have and use them judiciously. So you're hearing the tune Boston, but over the top in an obligato between the cornet and the trombone, you're hearing that opening blurb. Just coming through, just to unify and to make the motion of the song go forward. And it's also, it becomes a portent. It becomes a prediction of what's going to happen next. because once that tune is finished, it goes back into the opening of the first movement, that sort of festive compound thing that's going on, that blurb that becomes more active and just grows on itself. And finally, it now becomes a descant to Boston, played in augmentation at the end. And there I'm really thinking of those Isaac Watts words, were the whole realm of nature mine, just that magnificent text. And so it rolls on, and then you've got to end sometime, obviously. So it goes into a final key change, just to say, okay, here's the big finish. But it's really nothing more than the opening, just brought back in a different kind of texture, different key. And then the final phrase you hear at the end while they're holding the long notes is just that opening phrase of "When I survey the wondrous cross," when I survey. And that's basically it. I think it's pretty economical, this piece, for being 3 movements. It's not too long, I don't think. But I think it also sits well with an audience. I think they get it too.
Absolutely, and wonderful piece to play and to listen to there. And you said about the tune Boston and the theory that it came from Gregorian chant.
Yeah.
Pairing it with the chants in this music and those open sort of fifth accompaniments and
Yeah.
euphonium, was that an idea that you had, or was that sort of happy coincidence?
I would have to say that's a happy coincidence. I don't overthink things, but sometimes you look back on it and you say, I can see why I did that, but I wouldn't want to go Freud on me there. I think it just happens that way. And again, composition is a result of influences and choices. So I chose the psalm text that I wanted. The tunes were chosen for me, but then how to exploit them, those were my choices. How did I see? And the other thing was to be reverent with the text. Sometimes I'll hear like a tune, an old song put in swing, like there's a Christian jazz band that a good friend of mine is in, and he sent me the recording, and it was great stuff. I mean, it's a full swing band, saxes, trombones, trumpets, the whole bit. And they're playing one tune. It's just really happy and upbeat, but I know the words. And the words at one point said, "Someone slipped and fell. Was that someone you?" And it just sounded so cavalier. "Someone slipped and fell. Was that someone you?" It's like, no, something bad happened here. The words say that. The tune should not be treated that way, So I try to let those words and melodies inform my aesthetic choices as far as how I'm going to paint this picture, how I'm going to make it look.
And I guess my final question of this piece is there a particular recording or performance that you've been a part of or heard that really stands out and means a lot to you?
I was very happy with what we did with it with the Chicago staff band, but I know that other bands have recorded it as well. And more recently, I was honored that Steve Cobb and the International Staff Band recorded it as part of that whole retrospective they did on the music of, and there were these various decades, and that came out in the music of the 1980s. And I love those recordings. I treasure them. And equal to that, I treasure the comments of Ray Stedman Allen, those informal interviews that Stephen would do at the end of the CD, where he'd masterfully draw out Ray Stedman Allen's remarkable insights. And I just remember when he was talking about the chief musician, Ray just said, "Yeah, there's nothing like it." And I thought, wow, this is from a guy who has written so many pieces that there's nothing else to compare it to. but I was pleased that the uniqueness of it is held up.